The Vietnam War stands as a complex and deeply divisive period in American history. Hey, I'm Ms. Volgotha, and this is my channel about deadly world's events. It was a conflict fought thousands of miles from home, in the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia. The reasons for US involvement were debated fiercely across the nation. Many Americans questioned the government's policies and the immense human cost of the war. This war did not just divide the nation politically, it also exposed deep societal fissures, particularly along racial lines. For Black Americans, the war arrived amidst the fervent struggles of the civil rights movement. They were fighting for basic human rights and equality at home, even as they were called to fight for democracy abroad. This duality created a profound and often painful experience for Black soldiers. The backdrop of the 1960s was one of immense social upheaval in the United States. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, challenging centuries of segregation and discrimination. Leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for non-violent resistance, yet the fight for equality was often met with brutal opposition. Simultaneously, the Cold War cast a long shadow, fueling fears of communism and shaping American foreign policy. The decision to escalate involvement in Vietnam was framed as a necessary step to contain communist expansion. However, for many in the Black community, this justification rang hollow when compared to the lack of freedom and justice they experienced daily in their own country. The call to serve in Vietnam presented a complicated dilemma for young Black men. On one hand, military service had historically been seen by some in the Black community as a pathway to prove patriotism and earn respect, hoping it would lead to greater civil rights. On the other hand, many questioned why they should fight for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. The irony was not lost on them. They were being asked to defend freedoms in a foreign land that was systematically denied to them in their homeland. This internal conflict, coupled with the external pressures of the draft and societal expectations, shaped the unique and challenging journey of Black soldiers in Vietnam. As the war progressed, the voices questioning its legitimacy grew louder, both within the general population and specifically within the Black community. The sacrifices demanded by the war seemed increasingly disproportionate to any perceived benefits. For Black soldiers, the experience in Vietnam would be marked not only by the horrors of combat, but also by the persistent sting of racial prejudice. They faced an enemy in front of them, and too often, a battle for dignity and fair treatment within their own ranks. Their stories are an essential, though often overlooked chapter in the history of the Vietnam War and the ongoing American struggle for equality and justice. One of the harshest realities for Black soldiers in Vietnam was their disproportionate exposure to frontline combat. This often translated into tragically higher casualty rates compared to their white counterparts, especially in the early years of the conflict. In 1965, for instance, a startling statistic emerged. African Americans constituted about 11 to 12% of the US population, yet they made up a staggering 31% of US ground combat battalions in Vietnam. This imbalance meant that Black soldiers were far more likely to be placed in the most dangerous situations, facing the brunt of enemy attacks and enduring the relentless stress of combat operations. The reasons for this disparity were complex, rooted in systemic issues within the military and societal biases. The casualty figures from the early years of the war paint a grim picture of this inequity. In that same year, 1965, Black soldiers accounted for nearly 25% of all US personnel killed in action. This figure is more than double their representation in the overall American population at the time. It starkly illustrates the heavy price paid by the Black community during the Vietnam War. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself poignantly described the situation, calling the Vietnam War a white man's war, a black man's fight. His words resonated deeply with many who saw their sons, brothers and fathers sent to the front lines in numbers that felt unjust and unsustainable. The trend of high Black casualty rates continued. By 1967, following the implementation of programs like Project 100,000, Black soldiers comprised 16.3% of those drafted and an alarming 23% of combat troops in Vietnam. These numbers further underscore the dangerous path many black enlistees and draftees were channeled onto. While the Department of Defense later acknowledged this imbalance and made efforts to rectify it, the perception of inequality, and indeed the reality for many, persisted throughout much of the war. The feeling that black lives were considered more expendable was a painful undercurrent for many soldiers serving in the conflict. This disproportionate representation in high-risk combat roles was not accidental. It stemmed from a combination of factors, including educational disparities that limited opportunities for technical roles, discriminatory assignment practices, and the specific targeting of certain demographics by recruitment and draft policies. For example, by 1966, African Americans represented over 20% of the Army's 2 elite airborne units in Vietnam, units renowned for their dangerous missions. The bravery and sacrifice of these soldiers were undeniable, but the system that placed them so consistently in harm's way raised serious questions about fairness and equality within the armed forces. Beyond the perils of the battlefield, black soldiers in Vietnam faced another insidious enemy racial discrimination within the US military itself. Despite President Truman's 1948 executive order officially desegregating the armed forces and the experience of integrated units in the Korean War, racial inequality was far from eradicated. Black servicemen often encountered prejudice at every turn, from basic training in the Jim Crow South to their daily lives on military bases in Vietnam. This discrimination manifested in unequal training opportunities, biased promotion systems, unfair disciplinary actions, and discriminatory job assignments, creating an environment where they had to fight for their country and for their own dignity simultaneously. The administration of military justice was a significant area of concern. Black soldiers often found themselves disproportionately targeted for disciplinary actions, receiving harsher punishments for minor infractions compared to their white counterparts. They were jailed at higher rates and faced more non-judicial punishments, which could severely impact their military careers and future prospects. Promotion opportunities were also limited. In 1962, African Americans constituted less than 2% of the officer corps across all services. While this figure rose slightly to around 2.3% by 1972, it was still far from representative. Black officers often struggled against institutional biases, including weak or prejudiced officer evaluations from superiors, hindering their advancement. Even in Vietnam, thousands of miles from American shores, de facto segregation often occurred. On large base camps, black soldiers frequently congregated in specific areas, sometimes dubbed Soulsville or the ghetto, creating their own spaces where they could find camaraderie and escape the pervasive racism. Adding to the racial tension, some white soldiers openly displayed Confederate flags on bases, a symbol deeply offensive and provocative to black troops who were risking their lives for the nation. These displays were not just insensitive, they were a constant reminder of the racial hatred that persisted even in a war zone, undermining unit cohesion and morale. The struggle for fair treatment extended to job assignments. Black soldiers were often steered away from technical or skilled positions and disproportionately assigned to combat arms or menial service roles, regardless of their aptitude or qualifications. This practice not only limited their opportunities for skill development that could be valuable in civilian life, but also contributed to their higher exposure to combat dangers. The pervasive nature of this discrimination meant that black soldiers had to constantly navigate a hostile environment, proving their worth not just as soldiers, but as equals deserving of respect and fair treatment from their own military. In 1966, the Department of Defense, under Secretary Robert McNamara, implemented a program known as Project 100,000. The official aim was to offer opportunities to young men who had previously been disqualified from military service due to lower physical or mental aptitude scores. It was presented as a social uplift program, a way for these men, many from impoverished backgrounds, to gain skills and improve their lives. However, Project 100,000 had a profound and often detrimental impact on black Americans, significantly increasing their numbers in the military and, crucially, in combat roles during the Vietnam War. thereby contributing to the disproportionate casualty rates. The program lowered enlistment standards, bringing hundreds of thousands of new recruits, often called new standards men, or, more pejoratively, the moron corps, into the armed forces. A staggering 40% of these Project 100,000 recruits were African American. Many others were poor whites and Hispanics, disproportionately from the southern states. While the program was touted as a chance for advancement, the reality was that these men were often ill-equipped for the demands of military service and, more specifically, for the brutal realities of combat in Vietnam. They received little of the promised remedial education or specialized skill training. Instead of being guided into technical fields that might offer post-service employment, Project 100,000 men were frequently and systematically assigned to combat specializations. These were the roles with the highest risk and, tragically, the highest casualty rates. The infantry, artillery, and other frontline units saw a significant influx of these less prepared soldiers. This channeling of undertrained and often educationally disadvantaged men, a large percentage of whom were black, directly contributed to the already skewed casualty statistics. It was a policy that, whatever its initial intentions, effectively fed more black bodies into the war machine's most dangerous cogs. The legacy of Project 100,000 is a troubling one. It highlighted how social engineering, even with seemingly good intentions, could have devastating and unequal consequences, particularly for minority communities. Many of the men who entered the military through this program faced immense challenges, both during their service and after. They were more likely to be disciplined, less likely to be promoted, and more likely to suffer casualties. For black communities, Project 100,000 became another example of a system that, whether by design or by default, placed their sons at greater risk in a controversial war. Section 5. By the numbers black soldiers in Vietnam. Understanding the scale of African American participation and sacrifice in the Vietnam War requires looking at the statistics. Approximately 300,000 African Americans served in the US Armed Forces in the Vietnam Theatre of Operations. This significant number reflects a community that, despite facing discrimination at home, answered the nation's call to duty, whether through enlistment or the draft. Their presence was felt across all branches of the military, from the dense jungles where infantrymen fought to the decks of Navy ships and the air bases supporting critical missions. Each soldier carried their own story, their own hopes, and their own burdens into the conflict. The casualty figures for black soldiers are particularly stark and reveal the disproportionate burden they shouldered. While an exact total number of black soldiers killed is sometimes cited with slight variations, sources consistently report that more than 7,200 black Americans lost their lives in Vietnam. What is even more telling than the absolute number is the of these casualties, especially in the earlier years of the war. As previously noted, in 1965, African Americans accounted for almost 25% of US personnel killed in action, a figure dramatically higher than their roughly 11% representation in the US population at the time. This meant black families were grieving at a rate far exceeding their demographic share. The high representation in combat units directly correlated with these casualty rates. For instance, by 1966, African Americans constituted over 20% of the Army's two airborne units in Vietnam, the 101st Airborne Division and the 173rd Airborne Brigade. These elite units were frequently deployed into the most intense combat situations, undertaking dangerous parachute assaults and search and destroy missions. The courage and skill displayed by black paratroopers and other combat soldiers were undeniable. However, their high numbers in these hazardous roles pointed to systemic issues in assignment practices that placed them consistently at the forefront of the fighting. It is important to remember that behind every statistic is a human life, a family, and a community. The numbers tell a story of immense sacrifice and often unacknowledged suffering. The more than 7,200 black soldiers who did not return represent a profound loss. Their names are etched on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C., alongside their comrades of all races. Yet, the story of their service and the specific challenges they faced because of their race deserves to be fully understood and remembered as a critical part of the Vietnam War narrative. Section 6. A fire back home, a fire in the barracks, racial tensions explode. The Vietnam War did not occur in a vacuum. It was deeply intertwined with the social and political turmoil of the civil rights movement in America. As Black Americans fought for equality and justice on the home front, Black soldiers in Vietnam carried these struggles with them, often questioning why they were fighting for freedoms abroad that were denied to them and their families back home. This simmering discontent, coupled with the pervasive discrimination within the military, created a volatile atmosphere where racial tensions frequently boiled over into open conflict, especially as the war dragged on and frustrations mounted. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968, was a pivotal and devastating moment that sent shockwaves through Black communities worldwide, including among the troops in Vietnam. Dr. King was a beacon of hope and a powerful voice against injustice. His murder ignited grief, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal. In Vietnam, the reaction was immediate and intense. Some white soldiers reportedly celebrated his death, burning crosses at Cam Ranh Bay and flying Confederate flags at Da Nang. These overtly racist acts, committed in the wake of such a tragedy, were deeply provocative and led to numerous confrontations and heightened racial animosity. Following Dr. King's assassination, racial incidents and outright fights between Black and white soldiers became increasingly common on military bases in Vietnam and even in the United States. Between 1969 and 1971, the armed forces reported hundreds of racial incidents, some so severe that they crippled the military's ability to function effectively. The Marine Corps alone documented 1,060 violent racial incidents in 1970. These were not isolated scuffles. They were manifestations of deep-seated racial grievances. Places like the Navy's Da Nang Brig and the Army's Long Binh Jail, often called LBJ, saw significant racial disturbances, with Black prisoners, already disproportionately represented in military stockades, protesting their conditions and treatment. The situation became so dire that major riots with clear racial underpinnings occurred on US Navy vessels, including the aircraft carriers USS Kitty Hawk and USS Constellation in 1972. These events forced the military leadership to confront the severity of the racial crisis within its ranks. By the summer of 1968, African Americans, who constituted less than 11% of the armed forces in Vietnam, made up almost half of the prison population in major stockades there. This stark disparity highlighted the biased application of military justice and the frustrations that fueled the unrest. The war in Vietnam was, for many Black soldiers, a war on two fronts. Section 7. The War After the War. Black veterans return to a changed nation. For Black soldiers, the return home from Vietnam was often fraught with a unique set of challenges, compounding the difficulties faced by all veterans of that unpopular war. They came back to a nation that was still grappling with racial inequality, and many found that their service had not earned them the respect or opportunities they had hoped for. Instead of a hero's welcome, they often encountered indifference, hostility, and continued discrimination. The promise that military service would pave the way for a better life frequently went unfulfilled, leaving many Black veterans feeling disillusioned and abandoned by the country they had served. Employment was a major hurdle. A 1972 study revealed a disturbing trend. Black Vietnam veterans were more than twice as likely as their white counterparts to be unemployed or underemployed full-time. The skills they had acquired in combat roles, where they were disproportionately placed, often had little marketable value in the civilian job market. Furthermore, many faced discrimination from employers who were either prejudiced or wary of hiring Vietnam veterans in general. The Veterans Affairs Administration, tasked with supporting returning soldiers, was also criticized for failing to adequately address the specific needs of Black veterans who reported being denied benefits and support. The psychological toll of the war, including post-traumatic stress disorder, also affected Black communities at a disproportionately high rate. The trauma of combat, combined with the stresses of racial discrimination and the difficult readjustment to civilian life, created a heavy burden. Yet, access to mental health services was often limited, and the stigma surrounding mental health issues could prevent veterans from seeking help. Adding to their alienation, some black veterans were even accosted by members of their own community for having participated in what was perceived as a white man's war, while simultaneously being turned away by older, predominantly white World War II veterans from established service organizations. In response to these profound challenges, black veterans began to organize to support one another and advocate for their rights. Organizations like Black Veterans for Social Justice, co-founded in 1979 by veterans such as Job Mashariki, emerged to provide crucial services, lobby for policy changes, and create a space for healing and solidarity. These efforts were born out of necessity, as black veterans realized they had to fight for their well-being and recognition long after their battles in Vietnam had ended. Their post-war experiences underscored the enduring impact of racial inequality on every facet of American life. Section 8. Striving for equality, lessons learned and the path forward. Despite the pervasive discrimination and the disproportionate sacrifices, African American soldiers served in Vietnam with undeniable courage, skill, and distinction. Their contributions were immense, and many displayed extraordinary heroism under the most trying circumstances. 23 African Americans received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor, for their service in Vietnam. One such hero was Private First Class James Anderson, Jr., who in 1967 posthumously became the first African American Marine to receive the Medal of Honor. He sacrificed his life by smothering a grenade to save his comrades, an act of supreme bravery that epitomized the dedication of many black servicemen. The acute racial tensions and numerous incidents that plagued the military during the Vietnam War, particularly in the late 1960s and early 1970s, did not go entirely unnoticed by the Pentagon. The widespread unrest and its impact on military readiness forced the Department of Defense to begin acknowledging the deep-seated problems of racial discrimination within its ranks. In December 1970, a significant directive was issued, stating that military officers who failed to take active measures against discrimination would be relieved of their command. Steps were also initiated to address the glaring shortage of black officers and to improve equal opportunity programs. These reforms, born out of crisis, were a slow and often painful process. They included efforts to enhance cross-cultural communication, implement race relations training, and establish more equitable promotion and assignment systems. While these measures did not eradicate racism overnight, they represented an important, albeit overdue, recognition that the military could not function effectively while perpetuating the same injustices that soldiers were ostensibly fighting against abroad. The struggles and sacrifices of African American veterans in Vietnam, therefore, played a crucial role in pushing the armed forces toward greater, though still imperfect, equality. The legacy of black soldiers in Vietnam is thus a complex tapestry of valor, injustice, resilience, and ultimately, a catalyst for change. Their experiences highlighted the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy overseas while being denied full citizenship at home. They forced a reluctant institution to confront its own prejudices. The path forward requires a continued commitment to understanding this history, honoring the sacrifices made, and ensuring that the lessons learned about equality, justice, and the human cost of discrimination are never forgotten, both within the military and in society at large. Section 9. A Plea for Peace. Remembering the Sacrifices. The story of black soldiers in Vietnam is a profound testament to the human spirit's capacity for endurance and courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. They navigated the horrors of war while simultaneously battling the insidious forces of racial prejudice. Their sacrifices were immense, paid in blood, sweat and tears on foreign soil, and often met with indifference or further injustice upon their return home. Remembering their untold stories is not merely an act of historical correction, it is a moral imperative. It compels us to acknowledge the deep wounds inflicted by war and discrimination, and to reflect on the true cost of conflict. The Vietnam War, with its devastating human toll and its deep societal divisions, serves as a stark reminder of the futility and tragedy of armed conflict. It underscores the urgent need for humanity to strive for more civilized and peaceful means of resolving disputes. No individual, regardless of their race, nationality, or creed, should have to experience the horrors of war, the loss of comrades, or the lasting trauma that combat inflicts upon the body and soul. The experiences of black soldiers, who bore a disproportionate burden in Vietnam, add another layer to this plea for peace, highlighting how war can exacerbate existing inequalities and injustices. Building a more equitable and peaceful world requires a genuine commitment to understanding and addressing the root causes of conflict, including poverty, injustice, and intolerance. It demands that we listen to the voices of those who have borne the brunt of war, like the black veterans of Vietnam, whose experiences were for too long marginalized. Their fight for equality within the military and their struggles for recognition afterward are part of a larger, ongoing quest for a society where every individual is treated with dignity and respect, and where opportunities are not dictated by the color of one's skin. Ultimately, honoring the sacrifices of black soldiers in Vietnam, and indeed all soldiers who have suffered through war, means working tirelessly to create a future where such sacrifices are no longer necessary. It means fostering empathy, promoting dialogue, and championing justice both at home and abroad. It means remembering that the pursuit of peace is not a passive endeavor, but an active, ongoing commitment to building a world where the horrors of the battlefield are relegated to the pages of history, and where every human life is valued and protected. Let their untold stories fuel our resolve for a better, more peaceful tomorrow.